In my last video, I covered the history and lore of various Australian cities, and I thought I might as well do a brief overview of some of the lore of the major cities of New Zealand. If you don't know, I produced a number of videos on the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, most of which were from the Middle East. I then moved on to other parts of the world. For example, Europe had many cities dating back to classical antiquity. But I thought I might as well do a video on New Zealand. The reason being is that while New Zealand is almost never thought of as an important historical country, it nonetheless is fascinating because it was one of the last, well, actually the last landmass or major landmass to be inhabited by humans, roughly around the 1300s. To put that into perspective, the Crusades and Genghis Khan's conquest all came and gone before a single human set foot on what we now know as New Zealand, at least to our knowledge today. Even the Maori or Maori people, who were quite possibly the most impressive navigators in the world, tracing their origin to the island of Taiwan and quickly spreading out through Hawaii to Easter Island, only reached New Zealand during the Middle Ages, and not even the low Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages. Now, it's important to note that the early Maori people were not a unified empire. They were a series of various tribes, with different languages but all belonging to the same language group. They eventually would land in New Zealand and would divide themselves among various tribal groups, oftentimes clashing. However, the social fabric would change with the arrival of Europeans. The Dutch would first explore but not permanently settle this land, followed by the British. Captain Cook would map out much of the coastline. And eventually, a bunch of whalers and sealers would take note of the rich maritime resources. After all, luxury resources are one of the primary drivers of exploration, and this was certainly true during the mid-1800s. Even American sailors from New England would arrive and set up posts for whaling and sealing, but it would be the British that would set up their first European institutions on the island, converting much of the population to Christianity, but also providing the indigenous people with guns. This led to the Musket Wars, which made the already existing wars between Maori tribes far more deadly. The decline of the indigenous population brought about by these wars, along with diseases, led to a vacuum in which various immigrants could migrate and set up colonies. So, let's start off with Wellington. While not the first European settlement in New Zealand, Wellington would be the first truly successful one, at least the one of any significance. This was set up by the New Zealand Company to sell land to British settlers. The city was founded in 1839, and the next year it was declared to be the capital. It's kind of easy to be the capital of New Zealand when you're the only real settlement in New Zealand. Having learned their mistakes from the American Revolution, the British allowed the settlers to have far more autonomy over their own affairs than they did in the original 13 colonies, which broke off and became the United States. For this reason, here, the New Zealand Parliament had far more power. It was far less restrictive towards the settlers, and as a result, there was far less resentment towards British authorities and the Crown. Its physical geography, located on what was a pretty good harbor, made it a pretty important port. However, the city's commercial and cultural significance decreased to the rise of another one, Auckland. Auckland was founded a year after Wellington, and it has one of the coolest topographies in the world. Almost everywhere in the city is nearby the ocean. Its easy access to water and excellent climate made it really, really popular among the Maori people before the white settlers came about. These native peoples did not live in a city, but rather fortified villages, oftentimes warring against each other. With the muskets, their populations eventually became decimated. And this allowed a whole bunch of settlers from Britain to then set up a, city in the area. Relations between the indigenous Maori people and the white Pakeha people was far from perfect, but it was certainly far better off than what was going on in Australia at the time. And I would probably say that New Zealand's history in regards to their treatment of indigenous peoples is probably better than any other settler colonial state. For this reason, the city maintained fairly cordial relations with various chieftains. However, some of the initial conflict did lead to a lot of military families moving into the city, which, despite some of the baggage with that, did lead to population growth. By the turn of the 20th century, this population growth, fueled in large part to immigration, led to Auckland being the largest city in New Zealand, and to this day is the premier cultural and commercial center. Now let's move on to the South Island, namely the city of Dunedin. You probably have never heard of the city if you're not from New Zealand or have never visited it. I personally really like the city. I've visited it myself, and I think it gets overlooked and it should get more attention paid to it. As I mentioned before, Captain Cook had sailed across much of New Zealand's coast at the time when much of the area was riddled by whalers and sailors, primarily coming from the Anglosphere. The New Zealand Company would eventually set its eyes on the South Island. In sharp contrast to the temperate, hilly, fern-filled, temperate rainforests of the North Island, the South Island was home to the Southern Alps, one of the most majestic mountain chains in the world. And it descends into vast fields that are golden, perfect for sheep. In 1844, Captain Wing, and yes, his real last name was Wing, would help establish this city due to its physical geography. It quickly became the primary settlement for Scotsmen, choosing New Zealand as their newfound home, hence the name Dunedin, which is essentially another name for Edinburgh. It would not remain primarily Scottish for long, as eventually you would have other Europeans arriving along with some East Asians, seeking get-rich-quick schemes during the gold rush. This didn't produce sustainable wealth, but it did provide enough of an economic jolt to boost population growth. The city was able to use this wealth to produce an impressive Main Street downtown area, with fairly beautiful churches, and the country's first university. However, it quickly got overshadowed by other cities, and today is mostly seen as a college town and center for ecotourism. Last on the list is Christchurch. The physical geography of Christchurch was notorious for being composed of too many swamps and marshes, and as a result it was colonized after Dunedin. However, it was chosen as the premier religious destination for settlers at a time when New Zealand, and really Britain, was far more religious than it is today. And it's not a surprise where the name Christchurch comes from. During the mid to late 1800s, this city was renowned for the construction of some of the most beautiful churches in the world in accordance to the Gothic Revival architectural movement. This was a movement that basically took the French Gothic architecture from the Middle Ages and put a more modern Anglo spin on it. The big catch was that this was on swampland. However, the swampland proved not to be the biggest geographic issue. That would be the seismic activity. The city was eventually hit by a number of various earthquakes, which did considerable damage to its heritage district. Eventually, it would get outshined by Auckland as the main commercial center and Wellington as the political capital. It did make some headway by being the gateway to Antarctica, but given the fact that Antarctica is mostly used for scientific purposes and not commercial purposes, it is unlikely that this will result in Christchurch regaining ground compared to other New Zealand cities. Moving on to the more darker modern history, I did mention the earthquakes. And you probably have heard of the 2010 earthquake, which had a magnitude of 7.1. There was a great deal of damage caused by this earthquake, including to the aforementioned heritage buildings, but not any deaths. However, just a few months later, another earthquake would hit. This one with a lower magnitude of 6.3, but with far greater consequences. It proved to be one of the most destructive earthquakes ever recorded in proximity to a densely populated urban area, and killed nearly 200 people. It severely damaged a large number of the incredible churches and heritage buildings. And just because Mother Nature isn't enough of a bitch, that summer it was hit by an additional 2 aftershocks. Wide swaths of the city's electrical grid, water, and sanitation were heavily damaged, and it was shocking to see such a modern, rich, civilized nation like New Zealand with one of the finest looking cities looking kind of like a borderline war zone. The city also gained some notoriety for the Christchurch mosque shootings, but the people of Christchurch are nonetheless resilient. Many of them have fled the city to go to Dunedin and the North Island, but many have stayed, rebuilt, and have some pretty remarkable impressive plans for their new downtown area. This time with medium density buildings that are highly earthquake resistant. I can't wait to visit it again when it's complete. And there you have it. That's my brief overview of some of the major cities of New Zealand. I really like doing this video because it shows you that even though some parts of the world don't have incredibly rich ancient histories wrapped in legend and lore, they still have fascinating tales to tell nonetheless.